Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to welcome all of you who have made it here today. We're still waiting for a few more guests. It's a pleasure for me to recognize some familiar faces of former students, for example, who I guess took courses with us in the early years when the Monash European EU Center started in 2007. So hello also to all the new students. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Jason Collins, who represents here two organizations, in fact, so it's two different hats. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the European Australian Business Council, and I think you've been there since October 2007, but you were with them a bit earlier already, right? In an advisory capacity. And also, you've been recently appointed inaugural chairman of the European Business Organization worldwide. So that, I take it, means that you travel a lot in many different countries, and not just in Europe, by the way. And for us, it's a great pleasure to have you here to share your experience. And it's also my great pleasure to be able to work on this initiative together with the Faculty of Business and Economics. In the past, when we had joint events, they were always very successful, and I think it's going to be one such event again. And now Jason will tell us a lot more about the EABC than I could, of course, in the introduction. So I will stop here. For Jason, welcome very much to Monash University.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pascaline, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for spending some of your Friday afternoon. Obviously, this is the most dedicated group in the university who are spending a Friday afternoon here. Thank you to the members of the Centre and Monash University for hosting this, and it's a great pleasure to be here. What I'm going to cover this afternoon is, in some areas, detailed policy on Australian-Europe relations from an economic and commercial point of view. It's also going to be a story about the evolution of an organisation which has become one of the most prominent, if you like, in public policy circles in Australia through the connectivity that we have with government and with the diplomatic community and so on. We also will talk a little bit at the end about the European business organisations worldwide and how we work across 33 countries with a whole series of organisations on how to maximise business opportunities for European companies in third markets. What I want to do is to start off with a couple of anecdotes which sets the scene for the discussion this afternoon. I don't know if many people saw the reporting of Brendan Nelson's address to the National Press Club a couple of days ago. Brendan Nelson, of course, being former leader of the opposition, but for us, most recently as ambassador of Australia to the European Union and ambassador to NATO. What was interesting about that was he talked about three things essentially. One was his role as ambassador to the European Union, his role as ambassador to NATO, the importance of values and what that means in a rapidly evolving world where there are great shifts occurring in economic and political management of global issues. And then lastly, about his role now as director of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and in particular, the upcoming centenary of remembrance of the First World War, much of it focused, of course, in Anzac, but also in Flanders and North France. The second anecdote, or the second reference I'd like to make, is of a recent event that we held with the outgoing ambassador of Belgium to Australia. What he said was that if one thing could be said about Australian-European relations is that we are still haven't quite got there in explaining the story of Europe and Australia. And I think that is partially the reason that we exist, part of the reason why the EU centres exist. Because why? Well, I don't think this is any great revelation, because if you were to ask many people who are citizens of the European Union, and there may be a number of you here this afternoon, and were to ask, well, tell us all about the European institutions, tell us about how the European Parliament works, etc., you would probably have a similar response than you would to the person on the street here in Australia. European Union is, of course, a complex political, economic and social project. The other anecdote I'd like to relay is that many people bemoan the fact that Europe is so poorly understood and also represented here in Australia, particularly amongst the media, that whenever there's a crisis or so on, of course, you'll see coverage, generally covered from London, not from the continent, but you won't hear about the success stories, of which there are many. However, I was at a leadership forum a few weeks ago where I had the rather bizarre experience of sitting amongst a panel of people. There were 5 people. I was the only Australian. I started off, and then there were 4 others who were all from Europe. What happened was that I spoke about the opportunities, the challenges, what I thought was quite an objective summary of the issues and why it was important. We then had my colleagues from Europe all speak. Every one of them gave a litany of why Europe is such a disaster. And then we had a discussion that ensued, and then the moderator said, okay, well, we'll get concluding remarks, and they started, and I was the one at the end. Well, of course, when it came to summarising, our colleagues from Europe said, but where would we be without the European Union? Where would we could possibly not have survived, the political crises that have occurred and so on. At the end I said, yes, this is probably symptomatic of a discussion about Europe. It sort of goes schizophrenically from everything the sky is falling into where would we be without the European Union. And I think that's a very, one very key thing to understand is the range of the debate, and there is no consensus when it comes to most of these issues. One of the comments that Brendan Nelson made also at a recent conference in Canberra was about the problem, and on this point, is that within the broader community, you'll find every argument expertly debated and given about why the project doesn't work. What you won't find is in the wider population, the defenders of the European project. It's very much a project that is defended from within, but not well understood in that broader context. That's one of the key challenges. But what is important for us in Australia, we believe, is that the links in terms of institutional framework, the links in terms of commercial and economic ties, and also fundamental values when it comes to the operation of markets, the operation of so many things that we take as articles of faith, are very important for Australia and Europe to be working very closely together as we confront the challenges of the so-called Asian century. Sorry, just a moment. Yes, so the Europe today, and these comments that I make are the result of the work that we do in interfacing with the European institutions and with other business organisations. If we were to ask probably 10, 12 years ago, Germany was the sick man of Europe. And you'll see the Economist reports and so on from those times of how Germany was the problem, Europe's problem. Now, of course, it's probably transferred to Europe and the Eurozone itself as being the sick man of the world. You have the problems and the attention that is focused on decreasing public support for the European project, political instability in a number of member states, where the rise of fringe parties or parties that are now achieving electoral success to the far right and the far left. You have fiscal deterioration, the problems and challenges of austerity versus stimulus, the eroding sovereignty, if you were to talk to, and you listen to the debates in Cyprus, in Greece and various other parts of the EU. Questions of breakup of the European Union itself, recalibration, and so on and so forth. Then one of the key refrains is that too little has been done too late to be able to save the European project. Well, that was the view that was put across by my European counterparts at the conference that I was at just recently. But why does this all matter for Australia? I guess that is probably the first question to ask. every major economy in the world, if you count China, if you count the US, and you count the emerging markets, every country in the world counts, or sorry, almost every country in the world either counts Europe or the US as their major trading partner. So Europe is fundamentally important to the global economy. It's not possible to extricate oneself if, as is often the case, the focus is on China in a lot of public debate in Australia. Well, Europe is the major trading partner of China. So if Europe fails, then China fails, Australia. It's a complete circle when it comes to the way that we are interlinked in these markets. Where we see in Europe, there are quite differences across Europe. So you can't speak of Europe as one economy. You need to look at countries such as Germany, which is recording modest growth. You have the UK, which is bumping along zero in growth territory, I think, in the latest results. You have France, which is largely stagnating, and so on. But it is not a uniform situation right across Europe. You have painful contractions in Spain and Greece and Portugal, and the one thing that I guess worries most people is how long can the social compact remain in terms of the preparedness of population to stick with the pain that is being felt. Notwithstanding all of this, Europe is still a wealthy consumer market of 500 million people. It's a major global investor. It is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment. It's the largest trading bloc in the world. It has a very strong corporate sector. One of the things which is quite remarkable is that all of the focus on the state sector, you look at the corporate sector and still see that there are enormously successful and very strong corporations in Europe. Europe still has 1/3 of the Fortune 500 companies globally. And many of those companies, if they're not already here, are coming to Australia. Europe is a powerful engine in education, innovation, creativity, and in various other sectors. The institutional capacity of Europe is still enormously important in a global context, whether it be through organisations such as the EU itself, the WTO, OECD, etc., all located within Europe. Importantly, and The Economist has done quite a lot of work on this, is focusing on Europe as a global regulator. You see the emergence of Washington and Brussels almost as two centres of gravity when it comes to the regulatory agenda, whether it be across competition policy issues, whether it be over product standards and so on. There was a feature in The Economist, I think 2 years ago, which was saying that, in effect, Brussels is becoming the lead in terms of the determination of global standards when it comes to many of these areas, and witnessed by China, for example, often adopting the European standard when it comes to manufactured goods and so on, rather than the US standard. In the global context, which I referred to earlier, bilateral deals, regionalisation, and the G20 have completely changed the way companies and economies interact with one another. Dennis Richardson, the Secretary of the Department of Defence in Australia, has said that it's a mistake to assume that the Asian century will be peaceful. There is every hope and every action that is taken to manage that process, but there can't be taken for granted, of course, that it will be. There will be times where fundamental values are challenged, whether it be over territorial disputes, over issues such as food and energy security and so on. So where do Europe and Australia stand, and how do they work together? The challenges in Europe can be summarised as a number of multiple crises happening simultaneously, and the efforts by policymakers to try to address those crises at various levels. Fiscal crisis, banking crisis, political crisis. Fiscal, you have problems of politically unpopular bailouts, unsustainable social models, and the possible looming crisis of demographics in particular countries. You have banking and financial regulation, which I think it's probably a classic example of the disruption of technology, where innovation has far outstripped the capacity of regulators to keep pace with the changes that are happening across global markets. It is to us very clear that the bailout and the commitment to maintaining the integrity of various member states, not allowing Greece to leave the Eurozone, for example, is all about protecting the financial system within Europe and avoiding at all costs a sort of Lehman moment that would lead to destruction within the banking sector that could occur because of the linkages between the financial system right across Europe. The one thing that is probably the most stark is the incapacity or the apparent incapacity of particular member state governments to deal with the crisis, whether that be through the institutions that are in play, the political personalities that are involved, and in some cases the sort of centrality of the state and the sort of break that you have between the population and those who are creating the policies to deal with the crisis. So a lack of confidence. The premises of convergence have worked in some cases remarkably well, where a number of states have grown, their economies have grown very fast, but where the problems and the structural weaknesses have become exposed is the inability or the lack of progress in terms of productivity reform, structural reform, liberalisation of markets, and so on and so forth. Many people refer to the fact that, or say that the design was fundamentally flawed. Well, there were certainly aspects of moral hazard associated with that. But let's not forget that in the monetary union, there was the Stability and Growth Pact, which was the rules of the game, established that there would be no more than 3% deficits and that debt, overall state debt, wouldn't exceed 60% of GDP. However, the two largest members, Germany and France, were the first to break the rules. And the problem with the sanctions regime that was set up was that in order to correct this, every member, or a majority of member states would have to agree to punish the transgressors. But of course, you had a cosy arrangement of where a number of people said, well, let's not go down that path because it might be me on the receiving end next time. So as a result, the whole design was flawed, not through the design, but through a moral hazard in the way that it was pursued. One question which people are not able to answer is, what does a European Union or a Eurozone breakup look like? How do you pull apart the billions in contracts that have been issued denominated in Eurozone currency? How do you unwind the institutional linkages that have been forged? And no one really has been able to adequately answer that question. So, can we look at it and from a different angle and say, well, since the crisis, there have been quite remarkable transformations across many fields, whether it be the centrality of the ECB now as the banking regulator for, I think it's 150 of the largest banks across Europe, whether it be in the fiscal review or the review of fiscal positions of national budgets, whether it be the creation of regulators across banking, pensions and insurance that have been established, and so on and so forth. All which have happened with remarkable speed when compared to the sort of progress that is discussed but not acted on in moments not of crisis. The economic imperative is there to prevent a breakup of the Eurozone, but there is also a very deep-rooted political will. These are issues not well understood in the popular press, but are, the things that are binding the European Union together. What are the business needs, and what are the things that we've discovered in discussions with business organisations across Europe? The single market remains at the core of the European project, and every business organisation will tell you that the completion of the single market is a very important goal for European leaders to continue to pursue. The free movement of people, capital and goods has been fundamental to that process. A common trade policy in dealing with major partners such as China and the US, common standards across member states, the opening of Central and Eastern European markets, which has been a remarkable transformation in a relatively short period of time. We were with a delegation in Slovakia quite recently. The amount of foreign direct investment into Slovakia, the development of industrial capacity there over 20 years is really quite astounding. Peak industry and business groups say that the European Union is essential to the future of Europe. It was interesting that Sweden, which is not a member of the Eurozone, having a discussion with business leaders there, debating when the view was put that, Sweden must be feeling it made the right decision not to enter the Eurozone. Many people saying, well, actually, in the longer term, we think that was probably a critical mistake, because greater integration for Sweden into Europe is a good thing for business. What is the prognosis? The often mentioned phrase that Europe will get through, that it won't be a pretty or a painless process. But what will be needed is good European leadership, reform-mindedness, a focus on competitiveness, of maintaining support for those member states which are struggling. There is still the issue of how the European Central Bank intervenes, and issues particularly in Germany over the validity of that. But by and large, we have passed what we saw about 18 months ago, a sort of critical moment where the results of the Greek election were uncertain, the possibility that there would be default and what that might lead to in terms of its effects across Europe. Why is Europe important to Australia? Europe is Australia's largest economic partner. That's not well understood either. $1 billion investment relationship on a two-way basis. European investment is fundamental to the Australian economy. Australia's institutions modelled on European ones. It's not just the UK, which we automatically assume. Much of our social welfare system was adopted from the Swedish model in the 50s. Largest source of migration until the early 1980s. Europe is our largest services partner. Common approach to investment, corporate regulation and corporate behaviour. Driver of innovation and global best practice. And so on. Europe has been for a long time the largest source of wholesale funding for Australia's banks. So inextricably we are linked. One of the things which is again another reason for our existence is the lack of connectivity between Australian policymakers and their European counterparts. There are across Europe many countries which have been fundamental but are not well understood in terms of their impact on Australia. What I'd just like to talk about now is the EABC and how we were formed and what we do. We were formed in 1999 by a grant by the EU delegation. We were launched by the then European Trade Commissioner, Pascal Lamy, in 2002. Our organisation is made up of all the European chambers of commerce that exist in Australia, and we are focused on how we connect Australian policymakers and businesses with their European counterparts. There are two areas of focus, put simply. We promote the trade and investment relationship, and we also provide a platform for European companies to meet with people, policymakers in Canberra, and for Australian companies to meet with policymakers in Brussels. When the organisation was formed, there were, and this I guess is to talk about the evolution of the organisation. when you start with an organisation like an EABC, how do you actually make it work? How do you fund it? How do you attract members? How do you get champions amongst the business community? How do you find leaders willing to put their name to it? How do you access the right people that deliver the benefits to them? How do you build capacity? And how do you put a program together? What we've done is to build an organisation that has enormous reach and capacity in Australia. The business leaders that we've brought to the board are a good case study, if you like, in how this is achieved. Graham Bradley from the Business Council, you see a list of well-known names, whether it be the Maxwell Wiltons or Carla Zampattis of the world, who are all very well-known Australian leaders and who support the European-Australian business relationship. This is one part of it, and this has been an important part of building the organisation. Importantly, we have represented within the organisation people who are former political leaders themselves, ambassadors, people who have run government departments, and we have people who are chairmen of some of the biggest companies in Australia and CEOs from Europe, some of the biggest companies that are here present in Australia. Just recently in our council, we've brought on board David Gonski, a well-known Australian leader. We have Greg Medcraft, the chairman of ASIC. We have the chairman of Qantas and various others who have all come on board. Our corporate members provide 100% of our funding. And you see some of the organisations there that are our members. BHP Billiton, Link Energy and so on, are all very well-known organisations in Australia. Our corporate members provide all our funding, they host our events, they provide expertise and resources to the organisation, business experience and feedback. We are a representative organisation but not comprehensive, in the sense that we can't accept hundreds of members, otherwise we lose our potency, which is fundamental to the way that we operate. We're also very pleased to have a number of partnerships with the university sector. Themselves, education, I think Pascaline is still the second or third largest export service in Australia. So it's not just about education, of course that is key, but innovation, it's also a very important business. Also, part of the process of building an organisation like the EABC is to build a network of stakeholders. And this shows you the extent to which the EABC is networked amongst all of the key stakeholders that are operating in Australia, the chambers of commerce, embassies, consulates, and so on. Many chambers of commerce, European chambers of commerce in Australia have been present in Australia since the very earliest days. The British, French, Swedish chambers are over 100 years old. That's very old in Australian terms. Range in different membership structures, organisational capacity and so on. We work closely with the EU delegation to consult on policy issues, joint activities for incoming leaders and officials, information sharing, contact with the EU institutions, our annual business mission that goes to Brussels, and dialogue with other heads of mission and European member states. We have worked very closely to build networks with all the other peak business councils in Europe, Business Europe, Eurochamp, the CBI, BDI, etc., right across the European continent. We're also working closely with policy institutes, whether it be here in Australia, but also those based in Brussels, in various European capitals, not of Europe, the Atlantic Commission, Demos Europa, etc. And on their counterparts on the Australian side, it's the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, heads of mission from Australia in all of the European capitals, particularly in Brussels, but also in those countries which are the focus of much of the commercial activity, in London, of course, Paris, and so on. The organisation, we host events around the country, as in Brussels, Paris and London. We work in partnership with many other organisations. We have contact and access with the highest levels in terms of heads of government, key ministers, all of whom are very active. There we have the former Trade Minister, Craig Emerson, the Chairman of ASIC, and Martin Parkinson, the Treasury Secretary, just in the last few months. What we do have the opportunity to do is when visitors leaders are visiting Australia, President Barroso from the European Commission was with us a couple of years ago. We hold briefings and meetings at Parliament House, ambassador roundtables and various other events. As an organisation, we are an advocacy body for a free trade and investment agenda. The removal of barriers to business, and examples of that we've worked on, is infrastructure procurement is a very important area for state and federal government. There have been a number of processes that, mainly at the state level, which have been highly restrictive for European businesses to compete for. One of the things we found astounding in a visit to Madrid is that Ferrovial, one of the biggest infrastructure, logistics and so on companies in Europe, found that it was unable to tender for a major project in Queensland because it couldn't demonstrate experience of having worked in Queensland before. Now, if that's not an example of a restrictive practice, happily that is no longer the case. I would like to think it's had something to do with our representations, but one of the very interesting things is that you find in major infrastructure and procurement, transport and so on projects, that often it is only European companies that are bidding for those projects or getting into the final stages of the bidding process. So whether it be here in Melbourne, the trams, whether it be water, whether it be a whole range of things, you'll find, and it may be unknown, that these are being operated by European firms, and these are, in some cases, relatively new developments. In 2010, the then Prime Minister Gillard went to Brussels and announced that she would be seeking, or the Australian government will be seeking, a framework treaty level agreement with the European Union. This was a very welcome development, and we were very pleased to accompany Prime Minister Gillard on that visit. What that means is that rather than having an informal a partnership with the European Union, this was to take it to a new level bound by a treaty obligation, a series of treaty obligations. This framework agreement hasn't been concluded. There are, most of it has been, I think, successfully negotiated, but there is about, I'm told, somewhere between a 5 and a 10% area of issues that need to be resolved. One of these, or probably the major issues, relates to how Australia will commit to a series of linkage provisions which the European Union would like to see bound by that agreement, but also other agreements. Brendan Nelson had some things to say about this in his National Press Club address. What has changed over the last few years is that, to return to that theme of the global agenda, is that many years ago it was said that no, Australia couldn't do a free trade agreement with Europe, for example, because complementary economies in the OECD and else don't do FTA agreements with one another. Well, that's changed. Europe is now seeking a free trade agreement with the United States. It's also with Canada and with Japan. In Australia, it was said, no, we wouldn't be interested in doing a free trade agreement with Europe because agriculture would be the major stumbling point. What has changed there? Well, in the Doha negotiations, Australia and the European Union have worked very closely together on trying to resolve at the multilateral level an agreement. That, unfortunately, has not been successful, but there are opportunities for plurilateral agreements and various other things which are being explored, and of course the bilateral agenda. Economic diplomacy, there are two. There's a classical version which of course we've well and truly moved past, which is sending gunboats to open markets. That's not the economic diplomacy that we talk of this day. What economic diplomacy represents for foreign investors? Well, it's about market opportunities, about risk and reward, or what are the considerations, I should say, market opportunities, risk and reward. Risks involve economic and political volatility, the availability of reliable partners, the rule of law, tax arrangements, the prevalence of corruption, transparency and so on. There's the high risk, high return possibility in emerging markets and markets that don't have the same sort of institutional frameworks as countries like Australia may have. There are mature markets where there's the possibility for high return, particularly in new industries and so on, but there's also much more in terms of longer term and lower risk and therefore lower yield institutional investment. The Future Fund, which is, as everyone I'm sure would know, is the almost $90 billion Australian government fund, which is now very active in investing in European markets. The head of the Future Fund, David Gonski, has said the trouble for an organisation or an entity like the Future Fund is what happens when governments change policy, when tax arrangements are changed, not today, not in 2 years' time, but in 10 years' time. If you're a long-term investor, your investment horizon may be across 20 years, and so the risk is not so much of institutional failure or political failure, it's what happens when governments change. It's also worth noting, it said that that business is far too short-term in terms of wanting to yield the rewards of its activities and so on. There is also the risk of governments being very short-term in their approach and changing tack and changing the rules of the game. And that's not just in opening markets, it's also in mature markets as well. So there are both areas to consider. In the Australian context, the advocacy work that is